After 3 months of various levels of lockdown, Shanghai is nearing the end of the fight against the epidemic. While everyone is concerned about when the city will be fully reopened, the Shanghai government recently replied that Shanghai has never announced lockdown of the city, so there isn't a reopening either, and no reopening celebrations will be arranged. The resumption of normal life and production will be carried out in batches, and full reopening cannot be done all at once. The city will be opened gradually according to the sequence of precaution zones, control zones, and lockdown zones. The orderly resumption of access to residential areas, public transport operations, and vehicle traffic will begin from June 1st. What's even more ridiculous is that on May 29th, the leader of a relevant department in Shanghai also indicated that residence committees, who actually carry out the residential building closure and control, is an autonomous organization of residents. The actions taken by the residence committees fighting against the epidemic is a result of residential autonomy. The government is not responsible for the legality of the residence committee's actions, which are based on the government's requirements. The government is not responsible for the consequences caused by residence committee's actions. This is to imply that the Shanghai government believe that the residents being strictly confined to their homes, having to buy high-priced foods, and being unable to receive medical treatment when they are sick are all voluntary behavior of the residents and have nothing to do with the government, and therefore the government will not bear any responsibility. In order to make this point clear to the residents, the Shanghai government later warned the residence committee that no organization or individual may, for any reason, restrict residents living in the community from going out and returning home, or restrict employees from going to work and returning from work, which is implying that the residence committees should not be nosy and get in the way of restoring order in Shanghai. The Shanghai government's denial of the city's lockdown and its shamelessness in shifting the blame to the residence committees is astonishing. In line with the CCP's usual practice, one would have thought that the Shanghai government would announce the victory of the city lockdown, hold a large celebration to resume work and production, to reward the outstanding performance of those who fought the pandemic during the lockdown. It is surprising that the government would deny the responsibility of city lockdown and pass the buck to the residence committee to end the farce of dynamic zero COVID that caused enormous collateral damages. Looking at the whole process of Shanghai's city lockdown, it is true that there was no official document from any level of government approving it. Most of the lockdown measures were verbally announced by government officials and then carried out by various levels of government. However, everyone knows that this is the will of the government, and this is a loophole in the law enforcement. Now the Shanghai government is evading responsibility for all the consequences caused by the city lockdown on the grounds that there is no officially issued document. At a press conference held in Shanghai on May 29th, the officials explained the city lockdown as follows. Shanghai has never declared a city lockdown, so there is no reopening, and the term reopening should not be used. Shanghai's citywide static management is like pressing the pause button, and the core functions of the city have always been running during the period. The city residents expressed their disbelief and incomprehension. They believe that Shanghai's fight against the epidemic has always been carried out in accordance with the city government's lockdown requirements, with some measures even exceeding the standards of a lockdown. For example, roadblocks were set up around the perimeter of the city, and all vehicles were forbidden to enter the city without permits. City roads were blocked and no vehicle was allowed on the road without a pass. Residential buildings were fenced off with iron bars and wire fences, and some residential home doors were even chained. Citizens were required to stay in their homes and isolate themselves from their families in accordance with the city lockdown. All these were city lockdown measures. Measures such as blocking traffic, closing hospitals and stores, etc., are not something the residence committees can do. Without a doubt, during the city lockdown, residence committees really did many things that the Shanghai people found distasteful. For example, they hid away and even resold the donated relief supplies rather than giving them to residents. They forced residents to buy goods they specify at extra high prices, and inhibited residents from buying foods in groups on their own. After the partial reopening of Shanghai, some residents' committees still used their power to arbitrarily impose restrictions on residents. Residents must practically win the lottery to be allowed to go out, and only 1 or 2 delegates from each building can go out. Although residents' committees are not nominally considered government agencies, many of their actions were carried out in accordance with the government's verbal requirements. They played a key role in the fight against the epidemic, connecting the city government and the residents. Many of the tasks in the fight against the epidemic were done by the residents' committees. They receive instructions from the government and must carry out instructions to each household. They organize nucleic acid testing, they distribute supplies, and it is indeed unfair that the government is now shifting the blame to them for the various disasters caused by the city lockdown. This is why many residents in Shanghai have recently reopened by themselves, and the residents' committees no longer intervene. A netizen even commented metaphorically on this issue, saying that the melon we got today can be considered one of the biggest since the lockdown of Shanghai, too big for the city's people, including the residents' committee, to swallow. It chokes us in the throat, causing us not to be able to utter a single word, and almost suffocated all the people of Shanghai. It can be said that the Chinese government is very skillful in passing the buck and shifting the blame. For example, it is still propagated today that the United States was the origin of the new coronavirus. A new trend has recently been discovered in China's dynamic zero-COVID campaign. People inside the epidemic prevention system began to be arrested. The purposes are to achieve the goal of zero COVID as soon as possible, to restore the economy, to give society an explanation, and to give people an outlet to let off steam. The reason given by the authorities is that some third-party nucleic acid testing organizations do not follow the testing specification, resulting in decreased accuracy of testing results. The unspoken meaning is that the responsibility for failing to reach the goals of zero COVID and reopening the city lies with some officials on the epidemic prevention front, as well as certain nucleic acid testing contractors. Their failure to follow regulations have led to inaccurate results, false negatives, and infected people being unscreened. There is nothing wrong with the zero COVID policy. The lockdown could have been completed sooner if there weren't these corrupt people prolonging the process. It is the corrupt people who made the common people suffer a lot, so they are to blame, and everything will be fine once they are arrested. Obviously, this is another move by the Chinese Communist Party authorities to shake off the blame and pass the buck. In China, there is another measure that always accompanies the dynamic zero-COVID policy, and that is the high-frequency, wide-range, and permanent nucleic acid testings. A positive testing result can lead to something as small as an isolation of a resident, a family, or a residential building, or lead to something as big as the shutdown of an entire factory, an area, or even the lockdown of an entire city. The lockdown is followed by more frequent nucleic acid testing, which leads to a vicious cycle that prevents people from resuming their normal lives. This high frequency of being stabbed in the nose and throat not only causes people physical pain, but also mental stress and rejection. Children in particular are disgusted by this. In some cities, there have been no positive cases for 2 years, yet normalized nucleic acid testing are still required. According to the estimate by the Huachuang Securities, the cost of frequent nucleic acid testing in China since the new round of COVID outbreak is about 300 billion RMB, and only in the first 4 months of 2022, 150 billion RMB has been spent. Such a large market and huge amounts of government funding to the corrupt bureaucracy of the CCP have turned out to be a tool for all the powerful groups to rake in money. As a result, all kinds of nucleic acid testing fraud and collusion between government and business are at play. On April 16th, the official website of the China's Supervisory Commission of the Central Discipline Inspection Commission reported that Yu Luming, vice chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference and director of the Healthcare Commission in Beijing, was investigated. It was rumored that he was allegedly colluding with medical groups to receive kickbacks from nucleic acid testing companies. Within 9 days from May 21st, 3 so-called third-party testing organizations were investigated in Beijing. On May 21st, Pushi Medical Testing Company was investigated. The company was registered after the start of the epidemic in 2020 and directly adopted the fraudulent practice of less testing and omitting tests. They test only 250 tubes of samples out of 1,000 to issue reports. They report negative results for untested samples. If symptomatic patients are found, they will perform another round of massive testing. This secures the company's never-ending business and countless amounts of money. On May 28th, Beijing Jingjun Medical Lab was investigated. The reason was the fraudulency of non-compliant mixed-tube testing. For example, the current popular method of large-scale nucleic acid testing is the 10-mix testing. That is, samples taken from 10 people mixed into one tube using only one reagent to test and getting only one result. If the result is negative, then all 10 are negative. If the result is positive, then all 10 are isolated and then testing are repeated until the positive infected patients are identified. Mixing is a means to improve efficiency in large-scale screenings. 5-mix and 10-mix are in line with the regulations and also saves the cost of reagents. However, the problem lies in the company further mixing the 5-mix and 10-mix on top of each other. Someone posted on Twitter that one of his friends collects samples on behalf of the testing company. The samples taken from site were all 10 mixes. After coming back, a single sample is taken from each 10 mix, and 20 10 mixes that contained 200 samples are concentrated into a 20 mix tube. He receives 8 yuan for a sample, and he only needs to pay 38 yuan by sending the concentrated 20 mix tube to the testing company. This way, his profit for 200 samples is 1,562 yuan. His company can take samples from 3,000 to 5,000 people a day, so the profit can reach 23,430 to 39,050 yuan a day. It's natural that unscrupulous people will try to get this kind of lucrative profit. For the investigated company, Zhongtong Lanbo, the problem also lies in the mixed inspection. There is a leaked video showing that someone in a residential area found the samples that were just taken were discarded in a hidden place by the sampling company. Not just in Beijing, a number of companies have also been investigated for similar fraudulent nucleic acid testing throughout the entire country, and many health department officials have been removed from the office. These kinds of testing companies are certainly detestable, but the companies that get this business and dare to falsify it are generally colluding with officials and must pay a considerable kickback to the relevant officials. In the past, the cost of large-scale nucleic acid testing was generally paid for by both the health insurance and local finances. On May 26, the National Health Insurance Administration issued a notice specifying that local governments are fully responsible for the cost of regular nucleic acid testing and may not use health insurance funds to pay for it. This is a great pressure for the local government, which is already heavily indebted, to pay for this cost. The fact that medical insurance funds cannot be used essentially cuts off the funding for nucleic acid testing. When many testing companies that collect samples heard the news, they stopped business immediately. They are concerned about doing it for nothing and may not get their money back. Some local governments have changed from performing one round of nucleic acid testing every 2 or 3 days to once a week or every 10 days, or just let residents test at their own expense. Many cities have already installed a large number of nucleic acid testing kiosks due to the requirement from the Central Committee of the CCP to build a 15-minute nucleic acid testing circle. Some are not yet in use and are expected to be abandoned soon. This is undoubtedly a huge waste of money. However, the unpaid cost of nucleic acid testing is still a huge burden for local governments. Now that the local governments can not only get rid of the considerable testing fees by investigating and punishing non-compliant testing companies, but they can also take advantage of the opportunity to make a fortune by imposing fines. Secondly, they can win the hearts and minds of the people by punishing a few corrupt officials and making themselves look clean. And most importantly, they can successfully pass the buck to these unscrupulous testing companies and officials. Through this kind of move, the Chinese Communist Party can earn both fame and fortune. Truly a classic move.